Number 10. The Campanian Ignimbrite eruption, the ash cloud that darkened Europe around 39,000 years ago. In the volcanic landscape west of what is now Naples, Italy, the ground opened with a violence Europe has not experienced again. The eruption is known today as the Campanian Ignimbrite, produced by the vast system of the Phlegraean fields. There were no cities nearby to bury, no written records to describe the sky, no chronicle to count the dead. The people who faced it were small groups of Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens living across a cold Europe, already difficult enough to survive. Then the sky became the disaster. The Campanian Ignimbrite was enormous, one of the largest eruptions in Europe in hundreds of thousands of years. In a geological instant, it expelled immense quantities of magma, ash, and superheated gas. Near the vent, pyroclastic flows swept across the landscape with temperatures and speeds that made escape impossible. Forest, animal, shelter, hunting ground, and human camp would have been erased together. The world closest to the eruption did not decline. It was buried and burned, but the killing reach did not end in Italy. Fine ash rose into the atmosphere and spread across vast distances. Layers linked to the event have been found far beyond the volcanic zone, across southeastern Europe, and toward the Black Sea region. For human groups in those landscapes, the catastrophe did not need to arrive as lava. It arrived as falling ash, fouled water, dead vegetation, fleeing game animals, and ruined hunting territory. This is what makes the Campanian event so terrifying. A hunter-gatherer community does not need a city to lose its world. Its survival is stored in paths, river crossings, animal migrations, edible plants, caves, flint sources, seasonal camps, and memory passed from one generation to the next. Cover that network in ash, drive away the animals, damage the water and chill the climate, and an entire human map can disappear without leaving a ruined wall behind. The timing makes the eruption even darker. Around this period, Neanderthals were already becoming rarer across Europe, while modern human populations were expanding into parts of the same continent. The disappearance of Neanderthals was not caused by one explosion alone. Their decline was shaped by small populations, climate instability, competition, isolation, and changing environments. But the Campanian Ignimbrite struck during exactly the kind of fragile moment when one catastrophic shock could destroy groups that had no reserves left. For Neanderthal bands within the ash-affected world, the eruption may have been less like one deadly afternoon, and more like the collapse of everything needed to continue. A hunting territory known for generations could become unusable. Herds could migrate away or die. Plants could fail beneath ash. Groups already scattered across the landscape could lose contact forever. Survivors moving elsewhere would not preserve every story, every tool tradition, every bloodline, or every memory of those who failed to escape. Early Homo sapiens were not immune. They too depended on animals, water, stone, shelter, and local knowledge. Some populations may have endured through mobility and wider social networks. Others likely disappeared. The eruption did not choose between species. It struck every human group within reach with the same indifference. And then there was the climate. Material injected into the atmosphere may have intensified cold and instability, already gripping the Ice Age world. Even if the long-term effect remains debated, the immediate regional damage was catastrophic. In a landscape where survival depended on narrow seasonal margins, several ruined years could erase entire communities. Hunger leaves little archaeology, migration leaves fragments, disappearance leaves silence. That is why the Campanian Ignimbrite belongs among the prehistoric catastrophes that destroyed entire human worlds. It did not topple palaces or silence written libraries. It struck before those things existed. Its victims left no tablets describing the black sky, no monuments listing the lost, no stories we can securely connect to the day the ash fell. Their civilization was the living network of land, kinship, fire, prey, and memory. That network could be shattered as completely as any empire. The Phlegraean fields still exist. Modern homes, harbors, and neighborhoods now spread across and around the ancient caldera. Beneath that modern landscape lies the evidence of an older catastrophe, thick deposits from a sky that darkened, territories that failed, and human communities whose names will never be known. The Campanian Ignimbrite did not destroy a civilization recorded in history. It destroyed worlds before history had learned how to remember them. Number 9. Hekla 3. The distant eruption that darkened a fragile world around the late 2nd millennium BCE, while palace kingdoms still exchanged bronze, grain, gifts, and letters across the eastern Mediterranean. A volcano erupted on an island far beyond their maps. The mountain was Hekla. In Iceland, the event is known as Hekla 3, one of the largest explosive eruptions of Hekla in the Holocene. Its precise date remains debated, but its ash belongs to a period when much of the ancient world was already dangerously unstable. Hekla 3 did not bury a famous capital. It erupted far from Hattusa, Mycenae, Ugarit, and Egypt. But that distance is what makes it unsettling. A catastrophe does not need to happen beside a civilization to help break it. Sometimes danger rises into the atmosphere, travels with the wind, and arrives as a missing harvest. The eruption blasted ash and volcanic gases high above Iceland. Fine tephra spread across parts of northern Europe, leaving chemical fingerprints in peat and lake deposits long after the people beneath the plume were gone. The ash layer is small compared with the ruins of a burned palace, but it is more honest. It proves that the eruption happened, and that its reach extended far beyond the mountain that produced it. The greater threat may have been what could not be seen from the ground. Sulfur, rich aerosols in the upper atmosphere, can reflect sunlight and disturb climate after a powerful eruption. Trees preserve the effect with a precision no ancient chronicler could match. In northwest Europe, tree ring records around this broader period reveal episodes of severely reduced growth, summers too cold, too dim, or too unstable for normal abundance. Each thin ring is a season that failed to become what people expected. For a farming community, one bad harvest is hardship. Several bad harvests are hunger. Repeated failed. Summers are a political event. Grain stores empty. Livestock are slaughtered early. Trade caravans arrive demanding food that no one has. Rulers promise that rituals, taxes, armies, or divine favor will restore order. Then the next year fails too. This is where Hekla 3 enters the story of civilizational collapse. It cannot be blamed as the single cause of the late Bronze Age collapse. The destruction of the palace kingdoms was shaped by many pressures: drought, failing trade routes, internal rebellion, earthquakes, warfare, migration, and the groups later remembered as the Sea Peoples. The dating of the eruption does not allow a simple verdict, but Hekla 3 belongs to the same dangerous world of climate shocks and fragile systems. It represents the kind of distant atmospheric blow that a stressed civilization might not survive cleanly. Bronze Age powers were strong only because their connections worked. Palaces required grain. Bronze required copper and tin from distant sources. Armies required rations. Ports required ships arriving on schedule. Cities required farmers producing enough surplus to feed scribes, craftsmen, priests, soldiers, and kings. If climate damage weakened harvests across several regions at once, the network did not bend evenly. It snapped at its weakest points. That is the horror of Hekla 3. No scribe in a Mediterranean palace needed to see Iceland burning for the volcano to touch his world. A farmer could look at stunted grain and blame the gods. A ruler could face riots and blame enemies. A merchant could reach an empty port and blame war. None of them needed to know that part of their crisis may have begun as volcanic gas rising from an island beyond the horizon of their knowledge. In northern lands closer to the eruption, the effects could have been more immediate. Ash damaged grazing land. Cold seasons deepened. Communities living close to survival margins faced hunger, movement, and abandonment. Some left homes behind. Some left nothing archaeologists can identify except gaps in settlement and signals preserved in peat and wood. That is why Hekla 3 belongs among the prehistoric catastrophes that destroyed entire civilizations. Not because it single-handedly ended the Bronze Age, but because it reveals how vulnerable a connected human world can be to a disaster no one understands and no one can stop. A remote volcano can weaken fields thousands of miles away. Cold pulse can press against kingdoms already breaking under drought and war. A thin band of ash can become part of the obituary of an age. Hekla still stands in Iceland today, white in winter and dark against the sky. The ancient ash it released survives in bogs and lake beds far from its slopes. The kings of that unstable age are gone. Their palace systems burned, fragmented, or faded. But the tephra remains, a silent reminder that sometimes a civilization begins to die, not when enemies reach its gates, but when sunlight fails above its fields. Number 8. The Black Sea Deluge. The shoreline world swallowed by water around 7,500 years ago, long before pyramids, before bronze kingdoms, before written histories of floods and drowned worlds, communities lived along the edges of a great basin north of Anatolia. Today we call it the Black Sea, but the people who knew its older shoreline may have experienced something very different. A lower body of water surrounded by land where families farmed, fished, built shelters, kept animals, and returned to the same ground generation after generation. Then the water changed. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis proposes that as post-Ice Age seas rose, Mediterranean water eventually crossed through the Bosphorus region and entered the lower Black Sea basin. The most dramatic version describes a catastrophic breakthrough, salt water pouring northward in overwhelming volume, transforming an inland freshwater environment and driving the shoreline inland with terrifying speed. Other researchers argue the flooding happened more gradually. The exact violence of the event remains debated. But the central fact is haunting enough. Ancient shorelines where people could once have lived now lie deep beneath the sea. For the communities along that lost coast, the difference between a sudden flood and a relentless rise may not have mattered in the end. A home is not saved simply because it disappears slowly. Fields become marsh, wells turn brackish, fishing grounds shift, paths vanish, graves are left behind. A settlement built around a stable shoreline fails when the shoreline will not stay still. Imagine the first signs: water appearing farther into low ground after each season, salt reaching places that once supported crops, trees dying along the edge of fields, families moving their belongings uphill, certain the flood would stop, only to watch it return again. A village may survive one advance, it may rebuild above another, but eventually, the ground that held its homes, its cooking fires, and its dead belongs to the water. This is what makes the Black Sea case different from the destruction of a city by war. There is no enemy to defeat. There is no palace to defend. The catastrophe attacks the map itself. It erases the relationship between a people and the place that made their life possible. A family can carry tools, seed, animals, and memories inland. It cannot carry the shoreline, the fishing cove, the burial place, or the landscape where its ancestors had learned how to live. Marine geology records the Black Sea's transformation: drowned shorelines, changed sediments, and a freshwater environment becoming a marine basin connected to the Mediterranean. Archaeological exploration beneath the water has raised the possibility that traces of human occupation may still survive in the cold, low oxygen depths. In the deep Black Sea, preservation can be extraordinary. Wood, shipwrecks, and organic material can survive where ordinary water would have erased them. That possibility is chilling. If Neolithic structures or tools remain on the former shoreline, they are not ruins abandoned in sunlight. They are rooms beneath darkness, preserved below water that moved in after the inhabitants were forced away. A hearth could still be there without fire. Timber wall could still hold its shape without a family. A path could still lead between houses, even though no human foot has walked it for thousands of years. The flood may also have survived in another form: memory. Some researchers have suggested that a catastrophe around the Black Sea could have contributed, directly or indirectly, to later stories of a world overwhelmed by water. Before later, flood narratives were written down, displaced communities may have carried stories of lost land across generations. The connection cannot be proved cleanly. Myths change, memories merge. But the idea remains haunting because the event was real enough to create survivors who needed to explain why home was now under the sea. That is why the Black Sea Deluge belongs among the prehistoric catastrophes that destroyed entire human worlds. It may not have erased one named civilization with kings and archives. It struck earlier, when a civilization could exist as villages, fields, boats, animals, burial grounds, and oral memory. If those communities fled the rising water, their world still ended even if they survived. The Black Sea looks calm now. Ships cross it, Cities stand along its modern coast, but far below that surface are shorelines older than history. Places where people may once have woken to dry ground, tended food, repaired nets, and believed the water would always remain at the edge of their lives. The sea did not preserve their names. It preserved the absence they left behind. Their homes were not destroyed and rebuilt. The light simply withdrew from them and never came back. Number 7. The Indus Valley Civilization. The cities that died when the water failed in the 1920s. Archaeologists excavating dusty mounds in what is now Pakistan uncovered something the modern world had forgotten. Beneath the earth were streets laid out in grids, brick houses, wells, drains, workshops, platforms and urban centers built with extraordinary precision. The cities were Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Together with hundreds of other settlements, they revealed the Indus Valley Civilization. At its height, this civilization stretched across a territory larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Its people built with standardized bricks, standardized weights, planned streets, private bathing areas, covered drains, and wells serving ordinary homes. Mohenjo-Daro contained a monumental water structure now called the Great Bath, carefully sealed and built for a purpose that may have been ritual, civic, or both. And yet, the strangest part is what they did not leave behind. No giant royal statues declare the names of kings, no readable inscriptions list conquests, no vast tombs preserve dynasties. They left thousands of seals covered in short lines of symbols, often beside animals, but their script remains undeciphered. The civilization was sophisticated enough to build an urban world, and silent enough that we still do not know what it called itself. For centuries, those cities thrived because water made them possible. Rivers fed fields. Seasonal monsoons replenished the landscape. Floodplains sustained grain, cattle, trade, craft production, and the dense populations required for city life. The Indus cities were not simply beside water. They were systems built around its reliability. Then that reliability began to fail. Around the 2nd millennium BCE, the mature urban phase of the Indus civilization began to weaken. The collapse was not a sudden invasion, or one burning night. There is no single destruction layer covering every city. Instead, archaeologists see something slower, cities losing their purpose, trade contracts, standardization fades. Large public spaces are neglected, populations move away from major centers toward smaller settlements. Climate evidence suggests that weakening monsoons played a major role. As rainfall became less dependable, river systems changed. Channels that had supported dense populations could shrink, shift, or become seasonal. In some regions associated with Harappan settlement, water networks no longer offered what an urban system needed. A city can survive a war if its walls hold. It cannot survive indefinitely if the water beneath its economy becomes unreliable. Imagine Mohenjo-Daro not as a ruin, but as a living city beginning to understand what was happening. A well that takes longer to refill, fields that produce less than older generations remembered, merchants arriving less often, drains still working in streets where fewer families remain to use them. Brickmakers no longer producing to the old standard, because the system that demanded uniformity is breaking apart. No trumpet announces the end. People leave because leaving becomes more sensible than staying. That is the cruelty of water collapse. It does not need to kill everyone to erase a civilization. The Indus people did not simply vanish. Many likely moved eastward or into smaller rural communities carrying parts of their lives with them. But the city system vanished. The networks that linked settlements weakened, shared standards dissolved. The world that had built some of humanity's earliest engineered cities stopped existing as a civilization later people remembered. The silence of their writing makes that loss deeper. If we could read the seals, perhaps we would know their names, occupations, gods, merchants, places, or fears. Perhaps some sign would describe water, migration, or abandonment. But the symbols remain closed. A civilization of planned streets and covered sewers left a library of tiny messages, and no living person can confidently hear what they say. That is why the vanishing of the Indus Valley Civilization belongs among the prehistoric catastrophes that destroyed entire worlds. It was not destroyed by a monster from outside. It was weakened by the failure of the natural system that made its cities possible. The water withdrew, slowly enough for people to survive, but completely enough for an urban civilization to die. Mohenjo-Daro still stands in ruin today. Its streets remain straight. Its drains still trace the shape of a brilliant civic order. The Great Bath still holds the outline of water. But the people who filled those streets are gone, and the marks they left behind still refuse translation. The Indus world did not disappear in fire. It disappeared in silence. As the rivers changed, and an entire civilization walked away from cities, no one would remember for thousands of years. Number 6. Storegga and Doggerland. The homeland beneath the North Sea about 8,200 years ago, Britain was not yet an island. Between its eastern coast and the shores of continental Europe lay a broad, low-lying world of rivers, marshes, woodlands, lagoons, and hunting grounds. Archaeologists call it Doggerland, but to the Mesolithic people who lived there, it was not a theory, a map, or a lost landscape beneath the sea. It was home. People moved through Doggerland for generations. They followed red deer through forests, gathered shellfish along tidal flats, fished in rivers, built seasonal camps, shaped antler into tools, and buried their dead in ground now covered by waves. It was one of the richest human landscapes in northern Europe, a place connecting communities across land that today can only be crossed by boat or tunnel. But Doggerland was already under pressure. The Ice Age had ended. Glaciers were melting, sea levels were rising, slowly swallowing the lowest parts of the plain. Marshland expanded where dry ground had once existed, coasts retreated. Communities adapted by moving, returning to higher places, and watching familiar territory shrink across generations. Then, off the coast of Norway, the seabed collapsed. The event is known as the Storegga slides. A gigantic mass of underwater sediment broke loose along the Norwegian continental margin and plunged into the deep ocean. The collapse displaced so much water that it generated a tsunami across the North Atlantic. The wave struck Norway, reached the coasts of Scotland, and surged into the low, vulnerable remains of Doggerland. For anyone on the land that day, there would have been little warning. Perhaps the water withdrew first. Perhaps birds rose from the wetlands. Perhaps people standing beside an estuary saw the horizon change shape. Then the sea arrived, not as a rising tide, but as a wall of force crossing flat country with almost nothing high enough to stop it. A tsunami does not need to cover an entire homeland to destroy the people living across its lowest roots. Camps beside rivers, fishing places, shoreline dwellings, food stores, canoes, pathways, and burial grounds could be scattered or buried in a single morning. Salt water would drive inland through valleys and marshes, drowning animals and people alike, leaving behind a layer of marine sand across land that had never known the sea in that form. Geologists have found evidence of the tsunami in coastal deposits around the North Atlantic. In parts of Scotland, sand carried by the wave was driven far inland and left above the older landscape. On the submerged Doggerland plain, the precise scale of the human disaster can never be counted. Some communities may already have moved away. Others may have survived on higher ground. But the wave struck a homeland already being eaten by rising sea level, and after it, Doggerland never returned as the world it had been. That is what makes this catastrophe so brutal. It did not merely kill people. It destroyed continuity. A river where generations had fished became open sea. A hunting ground became seabed. A trail between communities vanished beneath water. Survivors could carry flint blades, antler points, children, and memories to higher land. They could not carry the country itself. The proof still surfaces in disturbing ways. Fishing trawlers working the North Sea have brought up mammoth bones, aurochs remains, prehistoric antler tools, flint artifacts, and evidence of human lives from a landscape. Now hidden beneath grey water, each object was once dropped, used, lost, or buried on dry ground. Now it reaches the surface tangled in nets, stripped of the names and stories that made it meaningful. Doggerland was not a legendary Atlantis. It was real. It had animals, wetlands, roots, camps, and people. Its disappearance was not a myth invented around a fire. It was part of the transformation that made Britain an island and remade the geography of northern Europe. The Storegga tsunami may not have been the only cause of that disappearance, but it was a violent blow against a world already running out of land. That is why Storegga and Doggerland belong among the prehistoric catastrophes that destroyed entire human worlds. No palace burned, no city archive was shattered, no king wrote down the losses. This was a civilization before cities, a society recorded in bone, antler, flint, sediment, and drowned terrain. When the water took it, history had not yet learned how to keep its name. Today, ships cross the North Sea above forests that no longer feel sunlight. Wind turbines stand over hunting grounds, fishing boats drag their nets across valleys where families once walked. And sometimes, the sea gives back a tool or a bone, a fragment of the people whose homeland disappeared before anyone could write that it had existed. The witnesses are still there. They are simply underwater. Number 5. The Younger Dryas event, the cold shock that erased an Ice Age world about 12,800 years ago. The last Ice Age seemed to be losing its grip. Temperatures were rising, glaciers were retreating. Across North America, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, horses, camels, short-faced bears, dire wolves, and saber-toothed cats still moved through the landscape. Human communities associated with the Clovis tradition traveled through that world, leaving behind distinctive fluted stone points across a continent becoming warmer and more livable. Then the warming stopped. In a geological instant, the northern hemisphere was thrown back into cold conditions. The event is known as the Younger Dryas, a period lasting roughly 12 centuries when near Ice Age environments returned, just as the world appeared to be emerging from them. In parts of the North Atlantic region, the shift may have unfolded within a human lifetime. For people and animals adapting to a warming world, the climate suddenly changed direction again. This was not simply a harsh winter. It was an ecological reversal. Plant communities reorganized, water systems shifted, herd routes changed. Habitats that supported massive animals began to shrink or fragment. A hunter who knew where mammoth herds moved, where plants ripened, and where rivers could be crossed might pass that knowledge to children, only to watch it become useless as the world cooled around them. What caused the Younger Dryas remains one of prehistory's most charged debates. The mainstream explanation links the cold reversal to enormous releases of glacial meltwater disrupting North Atlantic Ocean circulation, weakening the movement of heat northward. But another hypothesis argues for something far more violent. A comet or asteroid fragmented above North America, producing blasts, fires, atmospheric dust, and shock effects that helped trigger the cold. The impact hypothesis remains controversial. No universally accepted crater has settled the case. Several claimed markers have been challenged, and many researchers argue that climate processes explain the evidence more convincingly. But the debate circles around a real boundary in the ground, a dark organic layer at many sites, commonly called the black mat. Below that boundary lies the late Ice Age world of great animals and Clovis artifacts. Above it, that world is profoundly altered. Mammoths and mastodons disappear. Native horses and camels vanish from North America. Giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and other megafauna are gone or rapidly nearing their end. Clovis signature also gives way to other archaeological traditions. Whether the losses came from climate, hunting pressure, ecosystem collapse, cosmic impact, or some combination, the soil separates two different worlds. For the communities living through it, the cause would have mattered less than the consequences. They could not see ocean circulation failing. They could not measure platinum in sediment, or argue over impact spherules. They only knew that familiar landscapes no longer worked. The largest prey became rarer, then absent. Hunting strategies built around giant animals failed. Camps moved, toolkits changed. Memories of abundance became stories about a world children would never see. This is what makes the Younger Dryas so devastating. It may not have erased a city or a named empire, but it dismantled a human relationship with an entire Ice Age continent. Clovis people did not necessarily vanish as individuals. Surviving communities adapted into different ways of life. But the world their culture had mastered ended. A continent of giants became a continent without them, and the human future had to be built on the emptier side of that loss. Perhaps memories of catastrophe survived. Later traditions preserve stories of flood, fire, darkness, and worlds remade, though no specific myth can be securely traced back 12,000 years. But it is easy to imagine the survivors speaking about what they had seen. A landscape does not lose warmth, mammoths, hunting grounds, and stability without leaving fear in the people who endured it. That is why the Younger Dryas event belongs among the prehistoric catastrophes that destroyed entire human worlds. Its horror is not only that we still argue over whether destruction came from the sky or from the ocean. Its horror is that by either route, the result was real. Something pulled the climate backward. Something helped end the age of giants. Something forced human communities into a new world. The black mat still lies in the soil, thin, dark, and silent. Beneath it are traces of mammoths, Clovis hunters, and the last abundance of an Ice Age continent. Above it is a different Earth. Whatever caused the boundary, it remains one of the most haunting signatures in prehistory. The narrow, dark line where an entire way of living stopped being possible. Number 4. The Late Bronze Age Collapse. When the first global world broke apart around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was the most interconnected political world humanity had yet built. The Hittite Empire ruled much of Anatolia. Mycenaean palace states controlled Greece. Ugarit stood on the Syrian coast as a wealthy trade port. Cyprus supplied copper. Egypt remained the ancient superpower at the southern edge of the system. Ships, grain, bronze, royal gifts, diplomatic letters and marriage alliances moved between them in a network that had endured for generations. Then, within roughly a century, almost all of it failed. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was abandoned and destroyed. Ugarit burned, and was never meaningfully rebuilt. Mycenaean palaces at Pylos, Mycenae, and Tiryns fell into destruction or decline. Trade routes broke apart. Populations shrank. In Greece, the writing system used by palace scribes disappeared for centuries. Egypt survived, but only after fighting attacks and entering a long decline. A world that looked permanent fractured so completely that later generations remembered pieces of it only as legend. The archaeological record is filled with burn layers. Beneath later, soil are collapsed walls, ash, filled rooms, shattered storage jars, and tablets left behind while the system around them was still trying to function. At Ugarit, clay letters preserve the fear of the final crisis. Enemies had been seen at sea. The city needed help. Help never came in time. The archive survived because the city burned around it. But the Late Bronze Age collapse was not one invasion with one villain. It appears to have been a chain reaction. Climate evidence suggests periods of severe drought and harvest failure across parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. Grain shortages weaken cities, armies, and governments. Hungry people move. Subjects revolt. Kings lose the ability to feed workers and soldiers. A palace system built on surplus becomes fragile when the surplus disappears. Earthquakes may also have damaged cities during the same broad era. Bronze depended on distant trade because copper and tin came from different places. When sea routes became dangerous and trade corridors failed, the metal economy supporting weapons and palace workshops began to break. The world was connected enough to become powerful, and connected enough for disaster to spread through every link. Then came the Sea Peoples. Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III describe groups moving by land and sea, destroying kingdoms and confronting Egypt itself. The texts name peoples whose identities remain disputed: the Peliset, Jekka, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh. Were they invading armies, pirates, refugees? Displaced populations gathered into violent coalitions because the old world could no longer feed them? We do not know. That uncertainty is what makes them haunting. The Sea Peoples appear at the edge of a burning system, associated with cities destroyed and populations uprooted, and then they dissolve into history. They may not have caused the collapse. They may have been one of its consequences. A world failing from drought, famine, rebellion, earthquakes, and broken trade could have created the very migrations and wars that finished it. For the people living through it, the end would not have felt like one apocalypse. It would have arrived in stages. A caravan fails to appear. Tin becomes scarce. Bread becomes expensive. Refugees arrive at the gates. Rumors spread of coastal cities burning. soldiers leave to fight beyond the horizon. Then one day the palace burns too, and the scribes who kept the system alive have nowhere left to write. The loss of writing in Greece is one of the darkest consequences. Mycenaean palaces used linear B tablets to manage grain, animals, offerings, labor, and weapons. When the palaces collapsed, the script vanished with them. For centuries, Greek communities lived without the administrative literacy their predecessors had used routinely. When writing returned, it came in a different alphabet. Later Greeks inherited ruins and stories of heroic ages, but not the written voice of the world that had fallen. That is why the Late Bronze Age collapse belongs among the prehistoric catastrophes that destroyed entire civilizations. It was not one city dying. It was a system dying: palaces, ports, scribble schools, bronze workshops, royal alliances, trade routes, and the belief that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. The burn layers remain beneath Hattusa, Ugarit, Pylos, and Mycenae. The letters remain where officials left them during the crisis. The sea peoples remain names carved by an Egyptian king who survived them. But the world they entered is gone. Within a few generations, the first great international age of kingdoms became ash, silence, abandoned halls, and stories later poets could no longer fully understand. Number 3. Thera. The eruption that wounded the Minoan world around the 2nd millennium BCE in the southern Aegean Sea. The island now called Santorini was part of a wealthy maritime world. The people connected to that world are known as the Minoans, a civilization centered on Crete, but spread through ships, ports, trade, art, and influence across the islands. Their palaces were painted with dolphins, flowers, processions, and bull, leaping scenes. The sea was not simply beside their civilization. The sea was the system that made it powerful. Then one of their islands exploded. The Bronze Age eruption of Thera was among the most destructive volcanic events experienced by the ancient Mediterranean. At Akrotiri, a Minoan-linked settlement on Thera, archaeologists later uncovered houses, storage vessels, staircases, and frescoes buried beneath volcanic ash. Few bodies have been found there, suggesting many people may have escaped before the worst phase arrived. But they could not save the island. The eruption blasted ash and pumice into the sky, covering the settlement beneath volcanic material. As the magma chamber emptied, much of the island collapsed inward, forming the caldera that defines Santorini today. Land that had held homes, fields, harbors, and ritual spaces was ripped apart and replaced by a flooded volcanic wound. A community was not defeated by an army. Its ground ceased to exist in the shape its people had known. The destruction did not end at Thera. The Minoans were a sea people, and the volcano turned the sea against them. The eruption generated tsunamis that crossed the Aegean toward Crete. Along the northern coast, waves struck ports, coastal settlements, ships, warehouses, fishing places, and the infrastructure connecting Minoan power to the wider world. Archaeological evidence at coastal sites records destruction and marine deposits consistent with enormous waves reaching Minoan territory. Imagine the damage from inside that civilization. A fleet destroyed in harbor is not only lost wood, it is lost trade, lost food, lost messengers, lost defense, and lost connection between islands. A warehouse scoured by water is not only a building destroyed, it is stored survival gone, an economy wounded, and a palace unable to command what it once controlled. The Minoan world had grown powerful through the sea. Thera made that strength into a vulnerability. Ashfall added another wound. Fields could be damaged, water sources could be fouled, trade routes could be disrupted by debris and the loss of ports. Survivors may have rebuilt, repaired buildings, launched new boats, and tried to restore what the eruption had broken. The Minoans did not vanish in one afternoon. That is what makes the story more haunting. Their civilization was wounded, and then had to continue living inside the wound. Historians are careful here. The eruption alone did not instantly erase the Minoan civilization. The final takeover of major Cretan centers came later, when Mycenaean power from mainland Greece expanded into the weakened world of Crete. But a society does not need to die on the same day as a catastrophe for that catastrophe to change its fate. Thera may have removed the resilience the Minoans needed when the next pressures arrived, and what was lost was more than power. The Minoans used a script called Linear A, found across tablets and objects. It has never been deciphered. We can still see their palaces and the frescoes of Akrotiri, preserved in ash with their colors almost impossibly alive. But we cannot read their language. We do not know what they called the eruption, what prayers they made when the ground shook, or what stories survivors told about the island that collapsed into the sea. This silence may be why Thera has been linked cautiously and controversially with Atlantis. Centuries later, Plato wrote of a powerful island civilization destroyed by earthquake and flood. His story is not a proven account of the Minoans, and Atlantis cannot simply be declared Santorini. But the echo is haunting. A wealthy maritime world, an island shattered by catastrophe, and a civilization whose loss survived more clearly in imagination than in readable words. That is why Thera belongs among the prehistoric catastrophes that destroyed entire civilizations. It did not erase the Minoans instantly. It broke the maritime foundation beneath them, buried one of their cities in ash, sent the sea against the ports that sustained them, and left later powers to inherit a world already wounded. Santorini is beautiful now. White buildings cling to cliffs above blue water. Boats cross the caldera. But that calm water fills the hollow center of an ancient disaster. Beneath ash, Akrotiri still preserves rooms abandoned before the end. And somewhere inside the unread signs of Linear lies a civilization's own version of the day its sea turned against it. Number 2. The 4.2 kiloyear drought. When the rains abandoned civilization around 2200 BCE, some of the greatest civilizations the world had ever seen began to fail within the same broad window of time. There was no army crossing every border, no volcano burying every capital, no wave sweeping from Egypt to Mesopotamia to the Indus. Instead, the catastrophe arrived as absence. The clouds stopped giving what the cities needed. The rivers weakened, the soil dried, the harvests failed. Scientists call it the 4.2 kiloyear event, a period of severe aridity recorded in ancient climate archives across parts of the Old World. Cave stalagmites, marine sediments, lake beds, and dust deposits reveal a shift toward drier conditions roughly 4,200 years ago. The exact severity varied by region, and scholars still debate how directly the drought drove each collapse. But the pattern is haunting. Several early urban civilizations built around reliable water entered crisis at nearly the same moment. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire had created an imperial system connecting cities, farmland, temples, officials, soldiers, and trade across a vast region. Its northern territories depended heavily on rainfall. When the climate grew drier, fields failed and settlements became harder to support. At Tel Leilan, excavations revealed abandonment and a layer of wind-blown dust over the final occupation. A functioning city became ground the desert could cover. The literature of the aftermath sounds like a memory of starvation. The Curse of Akkad describes fields producing no grain, rivers giving no fish, orchards failing, and hunger taking hold. It is not a weather report, but it preserves the nightmare people understood. Imperial authority meant little once food stopped arriving. Akkad was not simply defeated, the environment that sustained its power was failing. Farther west, Egypt faced a similar threat. The Old Kingdom had raised the pyramids and built one of the strongest systems of kingship in the ancient world. But Egypt depended on the Nile flood. When flood levels failed repeatedly, grain stores shrank, local rulers gained power, and the authority of the pharaoh weakened. The Pyramid Age gave way to the First Intermediate Period, an era marked by fragmentation and memories of famine. To the east, the Indus civilization was also entering a long retreat. Its decline was gradual and shaped by multiple forces. But weakening monsoons and changing river landscapes were part of the crisis. Cities built around water, farming, trade, and dense populations became harder to sustain. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa did not need to burn. Their world could end slowly as people moved away from cities whose environmental foundation no longer held. That is what makes the 4.2 kiloyear drought so terrifying. It attacked the same hidden weakness in different civilizations. Cities depend on surplus. Palaces depend on farmers, scribes, soldiers, merchants, priests, monuments, and drains all depend on food growing somewhere beyond the walls. Remove reliable water, and complexity becomes a burden. The larger the system, the more lives it cannot support when harvests fail. There may never be a clean verdict, declaring that one drought destroyed Akkad, collapsed Egypt's old kingdom, and dismantled the Indus urban world. Civilizations fall through mixtures of climate, politics, conflict, inequality, migration, and adaptation. But that makes this disaster more disturbing, not less. Nature did not need to conquer these civilizations. It only needed to weaken the ground beneath them until every fracture became harder to survive. The evidence remains in quiet places, dust layers over abandoned settlements, chemical shifts inside cavestone, sediment carried from drying landscapes, cities whose streets outlived the people who walked them. No sediment core records the final argument over grain. No stalagmite preserves the face of a parent watching another failed harvest. But together, they show a world drying while early urban history began to break apart. That is why the 4.2 kiloyear drought belongs at number 2, among the prehistoric catastrophes that destroyed entire civilizations. It did not arrive as fire or a wall of water. It arrived as the missing flood, the empty field, the failed monsoon, and the dust gathering at the doorway of a city built for a wetter world. Its greatest cruelty was its patience. Akkad fractured, Egypt's royal order failed, the Indus cities loosened their grip on the landscape. 3 great river worlds learned the same lesson. Civilization can command labor, stone, trade, and armies. It cannot command the rain, and when the rain withdrew, some of humanity's first great cities followed it into silence. Number 1. Toba. The eruption that may have erased human worlds before history about 74,000 years ago. On the island of Sumatra, the earth opened on a scale no civilization has ever been forced to witness. The eruption of Toba was not a disaster in the ordinary sense. It was a super-eruption so immense that the mountain collapsed into the space beneath itself, leaving behind a caldera now filled by Lake Toba, a body of water roughly 100 kilometers long. There were no cities then, no temples, no written archives, no kings sending messengers to count the dead, but there were human worlds. Small communities carried languages, hunting territories, rituals, alliances, burial customs, stories and knowledge of landscapes learned over generations. Those worlds survived through memory, food, movement, and narrow ecological margins. Then Toba filled the sky. The eruption ejected enormous quantities of ash and volcanic material into the atmosphere. Across parts of South Asia, layers of Toba ash remain in the ground today, sometimes found beside stone tool horizons left by early humans. The ash is the physical signature of a moment when people living far from Sumatra faced a world transformed by an eruption they could neither predict nor understand. Near the volcano, survival would have been almost impossible. Forests, animals, rivers, camps, pathways, and food sources were buried or destroyed. Farther away, the threat came through ashfall, damaged vegetation, disrupted animals, and the possibility of years of climatic instability. Sulfur aerosols high in the atmosphere may have reduced sunlight and cooled parts of the planet, turning an already difficult Pleistocene world into one where survival became narrower. This is where Toba becomes more than a volcanic catastrophe. It becomes a catastrophe of memory. If a small human group disappeared in that world, it did not leave behind a fallen capital. It left no inscription saying who had died. Its language ended with its last speakers. Its knowledge of rivers, plants, animals, paths, ancestors, and sacred places vanished with the bodies that carried it. Entire versions of humanity could be erased without leaving anything we would recognize as a ruined civilization. The most famous theory connected to Toba argues that it may have helped force Homo sapiens through a severe population bottleneck. Human genetic diversity is unusually low compared with that of many other primates, and some researchers have proposed that volcanic winter reduced our ancestors to a dangerously small surviving population. The theory remains debated. Evidence from parts of Africa and India suggests some communities persisted across the ash horizon, and not all scientists accept Toba as the single cause of a near-extinction event. But the debate does not make the event harmless. Even if our species survived in larger numbers than the darkest models suggest, populations still faced an eruption of extraordinary scale. Communities were displaced, Roots were broken. Ecologies failed. Some groups survived and adapted. Others may have disappeared so completely that archaeology cannot separate their absence from the emptiness of deep time. Before farming, a people's civilization was not made of brick walls or written tablets. It was made of songs remembered accurately, migration routes known by elders, the right season to gather a plant, the place where animals crossed a river, and the stories that told children who they were. A super eruption does not need to wipe out a species to destroy civilizations of that kind. It only needs to break enough communities that their memories can no longer be passed on. The survivors would not have known Toba's name. They could not know that a volcano far beyond their horizon had altered their world. They knew only that light weakened. Food became uncertain. Familiar animals were gone. Children died. And places that once supported life no longer answered as they had before. Their explanation is lost. Their fear is lost. Their dead are mostly lost. That is why Toba belongs at number 1 among the prehistoric catastrophes that destroyed entire civilizations. The later disasters on this list left drowned villages, empty drains, burned palaces, silent scripts, and layers of dust. Toba may have erased human worlds before there were permanent structures strong enough to mark where they had been. Lake Toba is calm now. People live along its shores, boats cross water filling the cavity left by the eruption. But beneath that water is the wound, and beyond it lies a question no tool can fully answer. How many human cultures vanished in the dark after Toba, leaving no name, no descendant, and no story except the thin ash layer proving the sky once fell on them? Civilization did not begin with the first city. Human worlds existed long before walls and writing. Toba reminds us that some of them may have ended long before history learned how to mourn them.